that the way that we've put this forward is almost like two sort of separate things, mixed reality and robotics. And that's because they're two different areas that we work in, but they're areas that we work in together. So James and I work together in the Mixed Reality Research Lab, which James will show you a little bit about in a couple of slides. And then we also work together on robotics projects as well. So when we talk about these things, we are a team, right? And that's what Ian said before, even though the way that we've presented it is two sort of separate sections. And so we did that because we didn't want to do the Laurel and Hardy sort of me standing up for 2 minutes and then James standing up for 2 minutes. So we've kind of got two halves, but we do work together. So if you want to have a chat to us about those things, then you can talk to me about mixed reality and I'll know what you're talking about. And you can talk to James about robotics and he'll know what you're talking about. So I just wanted to clarify that. So with that in mind, I thought I'd introduce myself a little bit. This is a picture that James put in there. I gave him a picture of me and the robot, and you can clearly see who he thought was more important in that particular picture, right? That is actually me on the top left-hand side. You can just basically see the side of my chest there in the CQ logo, and that's about it. So I'm Michael Cowling. I'm an educational technologist. So it's all about using technology in the classroom and using it effectively in the classroom. And as I said before, that's in terms of mixed reality. It's in terms of robotics. We do some stuff in electronic exams. If you want to know about all of the work that we do, you can visit our website, which is the Create Lab, www.thecreatelab.org, and it tells you all about those projects and the exams and mixed reality and things like that. And a little bit later, I'm going to talk to you about a particular project that we're doing, which is a robotic teaching assistant, and using robotics. In particular, the fellow that's on the slide, he's a Now robot. Some of you might have used the Now robot in your school. He's used as a robotic teaching assistant in some of the work that we do. But before we get on to that, I'm going to hand over to James so he can introduce himself, and he's going to start off by telling you a little bit about the work that we're doing in mixed reality. So let's go switch.
G'day everyone, I'm James. I'm Dr. James Burke from Bond University. A little bit about myself. I'm actually a software engineer and artificial intelligence expert, and I shifted into the area of multimedia, mixed reality, when I took my position up at Bond University in the gaming and multimedia area. Essentially, my expertise in programming and development and mixing it with the visual arts and communication at Bond. And then I got a national OLT citation about how on earth do computer scientists speak with visual artists and connect those things together. So that's sort of essentially what I did there. And part of that process was to really think about what is the future of jobs, how do technologies help support that, but always thinking about pedagogy first and not just the gimmick of technology. And so I set up the Mixed Reality Research Lab, which is a collaborative lab across a number of institutions. I work with people in health science and medicine, in architecture, in ICT networking and other types of applications. I also do, and I have been awarded several grants this year to explore things like infrastructure builds, so the Big Pacific Motorway upgrade in New South Wales, and how we can explore mixed reality for communication, especially around community engagement, and some other projects in things like reimagining first aid training and a few other things using AR, VR, 360-degree video, that type of stuff. So, quick fire, I won't really go through it all, but essentially I really wanted to focus on why we're here, which I think is about the kids' future jobs, creating these established environments and classrooms that can help support those things. And we'll talk about a number of these factors today as we sort of go through this particular presentation. I always like to sort of start off with this slide about, is this all just a gimmick? And this was part of those on the Gold Coast would know the Gold Coast Mayor's Telstra Technology Awards. So I've actually been a mentor of that program for I think the last 4 years. And it actually has some amazing outcomes for students, especially those that may not even win the competition, going on to get Kickstarter campaigns and other types of things to essentially look at their entrepreneurial dreams and all the rest of it. But I do want to sort of highlight this because it does, I guess, answer those questions of, is this really a gimmick and how does all this stuff work?
Budding entrepreneurs are urged to get their creative juices flowing as the search begins for the city's youngest Einsteins. Some massive prizes are up for grabs in the Mayor's annual Technology Awards.
When it comes to technology, the sky's the limit. From mind-boggling virtual reality to cutting-edge robotics.
Hi, I'm from Tate.
Even the Mayor was impressed.
And who's going to win the State of Origin?
Queensland, of course.
You know, in my time as Mayor... Can you shut him up for a minute?
But it's exactly the creativity he wants to inspire, with teams of high school students invited to enter online.
To dream big and, in the technology terms, help us broaden our economy.
Last year's winners designing a social media site for young people.
It was an innovative way to keep out social predators.
One of the highlights of the program is the mentoring students will receive from experts in their field. And if you're a big kid like me, well, that means plenty of time to test out the latest gizmos and gadgets. Except when they want to take your job.
This is Ulysses reporting for 9 Gold Coast News. Back to you, Bruce.
That's a first, isn't it? Okay.
So you can see there's a play on obviously the nature of the serious, which is kids, getting in and doing entrepreneurship, and then the silliness with, asking about state of origin and using the robot essentially as a gimmick. And you saw that at the end there. And I want to concentrate not on the gimmick, but on the serious nature of all of these things. So probably one of the big things that is rolling around at the moment is a lot of, and I've done a number of presentations at schools and I've spoken to a number of kids about their concerns about future jobs, about where all this is moving, and parents as well. Should my kids do these degrees or these programs? I think we all understand that there is this massive shift in the way that we use technology, the way that things like artificial intelligence, robotics, automation, etc. is going to transition the workplace. I certainly don't think that we're not going to have nurses and we're not going to have, road construction guys and all this. I think what's going to shift and change is the way that they leverage technology in the use of their jobs and the way that they perform things. And I think that's important because people often get concerned about this stuff. So I've done a bit of research over a period of time. There's some interesting links there, especially the Four Corners expose that they did, especially around makerspaces, entrepreneurship, etc., and how you can leverage these technologies to really think about future jobs and these sorts of areas. I guess the big thing that I sort of point out is that, we've set up this, over the last, say, 30 years with this computer revolution and information revolution about new workforces and new placements. And unfortunately, a lot of what they're saying is going to be automated is actually that particular workforce. So all of those process workers in the IT and all that sort of thing. So we really need to think about what does it mean if we're going to be disrupting white-collar jobs, especially given the fact that in a lot of education and higher education, that's where we're shifting our kids into. So we need to think about that sort of stuff. I often look at the Gartner hype cycle for emerging technologies, especially around what sort of technologies and areas, that my research and other things might take and consider. Obviously at the moment, the stuff that I'm really concentrating on is in virtual and augmented reality, but also in areas like natural language processing, with gestural-based interface, with things like conversational interface, which you saw a little bit of in the video before. So how do we integrate these technologies and think about these, but also have this on the mindset of us in our schools about where all these things are coming and how they're going to work within our infrastructure. Additionally, I always think about skills, and it's something that often people don't think about, but we need to think about skills first. And what are the skills? Now, you look at these skills and you think, yeah, there's nothing new there, and really, probably not so much. Obviously, the digital literacy stuff, the ICT knowledge stuff is really embedding in there. But if we look at the basic skill sets that are required, it's nothing really different to what we've seen in the past. But everyone's all concerned about new jobs and all the rest of it, but the skills are still there. Maybe the way that we explore the way that we use problem-based learning and project-based stuff needs to be more embedded. We certainly can't go and use the old school parrot learning approaches for these things. We can't use those sort of methodologies. So the kids don't want to, and I don't think it leads to good outcomes. We've got to show a lot more practical aspects, skills, but also evidence of the students' abilities to do these things. Not just in high school, but also in primary school, but also in higher education as well. The Horizon reports always come out. I definitely encourage you to read them if you don't know about them. I'm sort of highlighting two here. One which is the K-12 Horizon report, which is international, and the other one which is the Australian Tech report. I also read the Tertiary Education Horizon report as well. And I think this is interesting when you think about as a global marketplace, and let's face it, we are a global society. We're not just individual countries. We are a globe. We are the Earth. And we need to think about how this market shift and trends are going to affect us in Australia and obviously the citizens that we produce of a global citizenship. So the trends that we need to think about, there's a lot about coding, obviously, and there's a push in the digital, in the digital programs to code. Michael might talk a little bit about coding and the use of these things for that. Essentially, the way that I look at it is that students have to be creators, and essentially they're their own brand. So rather than a student just thinking they're a student and they go off and do a degree, etc., every single individual is their own brand, and they need to think about themselves essentially as that. That I'm a brand and I communicate myself across the physical and virtual as a brand. And that's something about that creation, evidence of creation. What can you do and what is the process of that? And that needs to be embedded into the schools. In the midterm, collaborative learning, deep learning, let's throw in there things around learning analytics, the way that we can use artificial intelligence and other things to think about, maybe early intervention, these types of areas. And then in sort of the long term, redesigning learning spaces, and even, and this is especially in higher education, rethinking what is a school. And I know in our higher education, with the advent of MOOCs and other things, that they're really starting to think about what is higher education, what is education, when you've got massive conglomerate corporations putting massive MOOCs and online learning things, YouTube, all of this sort of stuff. Where do we fit in within that process? And I don't know whether that's long term or probably more short term.
Longer term for the schools.
Yeah, that's right. But I think that's something that needs to be considered also. And it's not just in the schools, it's also in higher education. Again, this was a Australian-focused Horizon report in 2016. And again, you can kind of see some of the things emerging from that. I know in schools, BYOD, flipped classroom approaches, problem-based learning, project-based learning, all of these things are starting to come in place, and they are in higher education as well. And even areas like makerspaces, 3D printing, virtual reality, augmented reality, these things starting to take place in sort of the next few years. So people always ask me, what is mixed reality? How does it fit? How do we sort of think about this in schools and all the rest of it? So mixed reality is a continuum. Microsoft is using it as their branding message for the HoloLens and for their VR holographic SDK, the software development kit that they're going to be using. But essentially, mixed reality is a continuum from the physical environment through to a fully virtual space. So that might be in the physical space, us sitting in a classroom, etc. Pure virtual might be something like Second Life, Sansa, one of those types of virtual world environments, or it could be a virtual reality excursion, whatever it is. It could be a 360-degree video that's live streamed through YouTube, those types of endeavours. And then in between there sits these sort of augmented environments, whether that is simply augmented overlays using AR, something like Pokemon Go, or something using augmented virtuality, which is essentially some of the stuff that Michael and I work on in the Mixed Reality Research Lab, which is blending physical and virtual environments and how we actually interact with those, or blended reality environments. And that's something that I think becomes quite fascinating when you start to ask the question, what is the real world and what is the digital world? And if we start to blend those things together, how can we imagine that? So, Bond's campaign, the Now campaign, really features this, and so I was featured in terms of this type of area, so I'll show you the clip.
I'm Dr. James Burt, Assistant Professor of Games and Multimedia at Bond University. What am I doing now? I'm exploring mixed reality. This particular area didn't exist 10 years ago. We are the ones evolving the tomorrow, therefore we have a good place to set the goals of where tomorrow is going to be for our students. So this is a simulation of a laryngoscopy with foreign body removal. It is designed to change the way that skills are taught to students. Traditionally it's done just with a 2D graphic in a textbook, but we can do that through perceived virtual reality. The way that I look at it is that our students need to be primed for the jobs of today, but also the jobs of tomorrow.
Virtual reality, augmented reality, but for serious purposes. So in this case, the actual project that we were working on there was exploring really the how do we get distance education students to be able to experience simulation work that those on campus have access to with high fidelity airways training dummies, and how can we start to build that familiarity and I guess fairness with those that are studying at a distance versus those that are on campus. And so that's where that project is, and it's sort of in journal publication, etc. So you can sort of see the idea there. So traditionally they learn 2D images, maybe videos, etc. Obviously high fidelity simulation dummies when they go to either on campus using face-to-face or maybe residential schools. But the problem is when they hit the campus, it's like, I've never touched these things before, so you've got to train them in how to use these things, which essentially takes time. And so if you can familiarise them with some of the techniques before they get there, then you can improve your workflow. The same thing happens in hospitals as well. So they want interns to be familiar with environments, etc. I won't show you all the videos. So another one that we looked at, and in particular with Michael, was this idea of trying to teach theoretical concepts. In this case, those that have some networking understanding in the room will get the idea of the TCP/IP model. I teach visual artists, and I'll tell you what, trying to get them to think about the complexities of computer science and networking is quite an interesting task. So I said, okay, rather than me theoretically showing you TCP/IP models, and I think the standard video is trains going in and out of stations and this kind of stuff, let me actually get you to build a network, so physically construct a network using various markers and objects, and then let's visualize that, so let's augment that particular network and see how those packets flow and how the model actually takes place in the real world. And then on top of that, what is the underpinnings of each of those packets, source, destination, etc., with the ultimate goal that we actually want to move that into cybersecurity and think about things like what happens if this infection happens here or if this type of attack happens there. How do you think about that? In particular around this blend of visual arts, computer science, and essentially bringing it out of the computer science realm to be more accessible to a number of different students of different backgrounds. Again, I think.
No, you've got time to play it.
Do I have it?
You want to play it? Yeah.
Fine.
You can get it to play now that you skip past it.
Welcome to the Augmented Reality Networking Simulation. In this video, we are going to demonstrate the construction of a simple network. The simulation uses a 5-layer TCP/IP model to visualize how packets are interpreted and distributed. The simulation utilizes augmented reality markers, which are detected and tracked in 3D space by a handheld device's camera. We start off the demonstration by focusing on the modem's marker. When we get close enough, it is detected and tracked in the simulation. Here, we can see multiple routers being tracked and added to the modem's network, indicated by the red connecting lines. When we pick up the switch, you will notice a new network has been formed, indicated by a change in line color. When we pick up an end device, for example a hardwired computer, which has a modem connected to its network, packets will start flowing between the endpoints. This is again illustrated by the network being formed on the right. Here is a closer look at the 5-layer TCP/IP model, which the simulation visualizes by simulating packet flow through the device's corresponding layers. Shown here is a visualization of the specific packet flow between two selected devices, achieved by tapping on the projected icon above each device's name. The orange radiuses, which can be seen directly under each device, illustrate conceptual attenuation of signal. As you can see, there is a continuous flow of packets between the two currently selected devices. To return to the normal flooding of packets, simply deselect both selected devices.
We're looking at how we can start to think about network security, being able to do injection attacks and other types of things into that. There's obviously a big push with the national science initiatives and other things to really think about education of cybersecurity and also the underpinnings of networking and other things to the masses. So how can we start to consider these types of visualizations, simulations, etc. into classrooms and other endeavours? Another case study that we have done at the Mixed Reality Research Lab is thinking about areas like anatomy. So I actually did one of the original studies looking at how we can explore 3D spatial manipulation using the original iPad. And I did that at Bond University with my colleague, Dr. Alan Sterling. And we started to think about what does it mean to spatially rotate and how does that actually improve the learning outcomes? So not just as a gimmick, but actually does it make a difference? And so we published that paper, I think in 2014, and it's done reasonably well in terms of impact out into society. And so I sort of started to think, how can we take that and make that start integrating things like learning analytics, the way that we can actually spatially analyse and consider environments. So the first instantiation of that was to start to think about an installational-based approach. So in this case, it's me there with a Kinect tracking my location and Leap Motion on the front and a Oculus Rift, and you can move around and manipulate and move the heart and all this sort of stuff. Anyone who's familiar with Unity and game development, it basically utilises things like billboards and other types of systems in there to be able to visualise and create those connections. And that's great, and that's wonderful for an open day or for a classroom-based approach, but it's not very accessible. And so then I started to think, okay, well, we need to make this accessible and be able to take that out to distance education students or the masses in a classroom. And I've got a few of the little headsets here, so you throw these around your class, just like $10 a pop or whatever they are. So you throw those around the class, and you throw a 3D printed cube with some markers on it, and then all of a sudden you've got the ability to track spatial movements within space. In this case, we can project a heart, we can run multiple choice quizzes and other types of things on that, both from from the different types of learning approaches, whether we want to do summative or formative based, examinations, etc. And we're not just tracking things like, did they get the answer right? We're thinking and looking at how did they get to those answers? What was the movement? What was the spatial consideration in terms of the rotations, the times, etc., in order to do those things, because that might mean something. We may not know what it all means yet, and then we can start using things like big data analytics, etc., on big, massive data sets around that and think about why wasn't they moved it in this way. It could just be simply there was bugs in there and therefore we can identify, usability problems. Or it could be that there's indeed something that's, that is there and why are they learning in that particular way. So it's rethinking about how we actually analyse learning, which we may not be able to do using traditional mechanics, using learning analytics. So in terms of the software and hardware, and this obviously comes down to the schools as well, There is so much. I mean, and this is what I've got to try to be aware of, and there's more here as well, just me, myself, and the way that I do my teaching and research. So, you've got Unity as a platform, you might use Unreal, you've got different types of interface devices, you've got different hardware devices, you've got your traditional visualization platforms, and also graphics platforms like Adobe. You've got 3D printers, you've got all sorts of things. And so it's quite overwhelming, especially for educators, to sort of go, wow, I've got to keep at the forefront of industry to bring this stuff to my students. So Michael will talk a little bit about some of the ways of thinking about of that and how you might consider this type of integration into your classrooms.
It's me. Hey. I will indeed talk about that, but first I'm going to tell you a little bit about robotics in the classroom. The STEAM infrastructure stuff is at the end, but that's something that we need to think about with all of these different devices out there, with the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive and all of those kinds of things. How do you guys, as ICT managers, work out what fits in best in your classroom? And maybe James ran around earlier and gave everyone business cards. I mean, maybe there's an opportunity there to come and talk to people like us, and we can give you some ideas, and we've done that before. But before I talk to you a little bit about that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about another project that we've been doing, which I've been focused on, which is using robotics in the classroom. And this is a hot topic at the moment, okay? And in particular, the Queensland government, for instance, had their Advancing Education Plan, which their action plan for education in Queensland. And as part of that, they had all sorts of interesting stuff going on. You might remember the hashtag coding counts. Yeah, so they're pushing for coding in the classroom. They're pushing for robotics in the classroom. And if you talk to the right people, they'll tell you that this is for what James talked about, preparing students for jobs of the future and developing their skills in critical thinking, in creativity, in collaboration and in innovation. If you talk to the wrong people, they'll tell you that the reason we're doing it is because everybody needs to know how to program in Python or, build Lego Mindstorms robots, which is not really what it's about. And hopefully you guys agree with me. But what we were interested in when we started thinking about robotics in the classroom is we were thinking, well, hang on, that's great that we want to introduce robotics and we want to introduce programming. It's great that we want to use this as part of the digital technologies curriculum to teach students all of those skills. But it's a bit of a hard ask sometimes to go to a school and say, okay, you should spend all of this money on this technology, stick it in your STEAM classroom and use it just in that particular area of your school. Wouldn't it be better if we could come up with a way that you could use the technology for more than just teaching those STEM concepts, for more than just digital technologies, in a general kind of way? And so we had a look at this idea of introducing technology into the general classroom, and in fact that's a lot of the stuff that James and I already do in mixed reality. How can we use technology to teach other things like paramedics and computer science and anatomy? And we said, well, maybe we can do this with robotics as well, and that's called technology enhanced learning, and it's bigger than this idea of teaching STEM or STEAM. It's about making all of your classrooms STEAMy. And so in particular with the robotics project, we said if we have a robot and if we're trying to convince a school to use a robot, then how can we work this into a more general classroom environment? How can we make this something that they can see how they can use it every day, all of the time? And we came up with this idea that we might be able to use the robot as a teaching assistant. So that became our case study. This idea that the robot can help out in the general classroom, not in the STEAM classroom, but just in the classroom all of the time. And this is based on this idea that teachers are short of time. It's also based on this idea that students sometimes worry about asking a teacher questions or interrupting the class. And I did some research work on that a few years ago, using Twitter in the classroom for students to be able to tweet the teacher rather than being worried about asking questions in class. It was about helping them to be more comfortable about putting forward the questions that they had. We got some interesting feedback about that work. Some people loved it, other people thought that we were cotton wooling the students, you know. But it was interesting. We often pitched it as an icebreaker, a good way for students to interact. And so we said, well, the robot can be a teaching assistant, and they can help, but they're not experts in the subject matter. Or usually the teaching assistants aren't experts in the subject matter, they're volunteers or their parents. So the robot can therefore provide students with a familiar humanoid system to interact with. In university classrooms in particular, this is the case. You know, it's a bit daunting at the end of the class when you've had 200 students in the class to go down and talk to the professor. And I went to the States last year, and it's particularly the case in the States. The professor is quite revered, probably more than they are here in Australia. And so the idea that you would go and ask the professor a stupid question, you don't do that, right? But in the States, they solved that by having a teaching assistant in the class. It's the PhD student that sits on the side, right? He watches the lecture. At the end of the lecture, the professor leaves and all of the students can ask the teaching assistant the questions instead, right? Much less intimidating than talking to the professor. And so we thought we can do the same thing with the robot. So in order to do this, we needed to think about what teaching assistants do, and so I had a look at some work about what teaching assistants do, and this is actually about teaching aids, very applicable to what happens in high school classrooms. These are teaching aids in primary and high school classrooms. This research identified the top 4 things that teaching assistants do. Number 1, they work with small groups of students on academic tasks like reading or maths or word study or science. Number 2, they provide general classroom support for the students and the teachers. Number 3, they do things like photocopying, data entry and filing. And number 4, they provide one-on-one support for students with particular disabilities or particular learning difficulties. And so we looked at that list and we thought to ourselves, we can do most of that with a robot. We can't quite get the robot to go and do the photocopying yet, right? And the data entry. He's not so good at data entry. He's only got 3 fingers, so he's not a quick typist, you know. But we can get them to do most of the other things. And so we thought we could build a system that would allow that robot to do that teaching assistant job. And so we did. And I partnered with a company called Acme Robotics, who's an industry partner, who own this robot here. This robot here is called Boris. One of the most interesting things about the Now robot, and this is a Now robot, is that he has a little bit of personality. If you've ever worked with a Now robot, he's got his own voice and his own mannerisms. So you very quickly start to refer to him in the first person. I do, right? When you hear me talk about our Now robot, I never say the Now robot. I always say Boris, right? But he's a person. Like, you know, he exists. And so this is Boris. And what he's going to do here in this video in a couple of seconds is show you the demonstration that he gives to the students in the classroom. So this is what he says to introduce what he does to the students in the classroom. And then we're able to use the robot to actually conduct the teaching assistant task. So I'll press the button, you get to do his intro in a second.
If you need me as a teacher assistant, please say teacher assistant or press my forehead button. If you need me as a lecturer, please say lecturer or press my top rear button. If you want me to introduce myself, please say introduce yourself or press my top middle button. Or if you do not need my help, say exit or touch the front of my feet at any time.
Introduce yourself.
Hello everyone. Please let me introduce myself. My name is Boris. I am a Now robot, the first humanoid robot of the Aldebaran company. I am the smallest member of my family. Other members of my family are Pepper and Romeo. Pepper is a companion robot who can perceive emotions, and Romeo has been designed to help elderly people, or people losing their autonomy. The first Now model came out 10 years ago, and now we are in our 5th version. Some of my strengths are my interactivity and personalizable interface. Thanks to these strengths, other Now robots have participated in television shows like Robots, where 7 Now were on stage. Others in robotics sport events or even as receptionists. Currently I am working with Michael Kelling and Acme Robotics, exploring how I can help in a classroom. If you need me as a teacher assistant, Please say teacher assistant or press my forehead button. If you need me as a lecturer, please say lecturer or press my top.
Well, Boris at the moment can do a few different things. Boris can deliver a small lecture. You see, I'm saying Boris, right? He can provide questions and answers to the students. So the students can walk up to the robot and say, do you have anything about database normalization? And the robot can say, yes, actually I do. You may have a recording from a question that was asked previously, or may have something put in there by the teacher that he can provide. He also asks questions on behalf of the students during the lecture, and this is what we actually started with, is basically the Twitter project, but with a robot instead. So the students are able to send a question to the robot, and the robot raises his hand on their behalf, and then the lecturer or the teacher goes over to the robot, touches him on the head, and the robot asks the questions for the student. And then he's also able to, and then records the response that the lecturer gives, so that you can then provide that back later in the question and answer session. And then he's also able to conduct a quiz as well. So he does small pop quizzes, you enter all the questions in them, and the students use their device to actually interact with the quiz, see how many questions they got right, as well as see how the class did as a whole. So the robot will tell you how the class went. So what he's doing there is he's acting as a teaching assistant. He's trying to provide that one-on-one support that we saw on the slide before, so that students feel like they can ask questions in class without being intimidated. It gives them the opportunity to go to the robot afterwards and ask him questions about things that they're unsure about, and it gives them this extra level of interaction. I mentioned before that Boris is a now robot, so if we want to talk about the technical details of how he works, he's a robot that's produced by a company called Aldebaran Robotics, which was bought out by a Japanese company called SoftBank recently, so look up SoftBank if you want to find out more about the now robot. He's around about 2 feet tall. He's got 2 cameras, and a camera in the top and the bottom. Don't ask me why they're not side to side, the top and bottom. And multiple microphones, including one on the left and one on the right. He's got basic voice recognition. The video you saw where he's actually able to understand Diego is us very carefully working out what words are the best words for the robot to understand. The voice recognition is actually a little bit dodgy sometimes, and you saw that in the Tom Tate video. Yeah. And then also he has full articulation, moving hands, moving feet, sitting down, laying down, all of those kinds of things. And he's programmed using either a graphical tool, Choreograph, or alternatively you can write code in Python to program a now robot. Now for our particular project, we then have several other components involving cloud services that provide the students with the interface that they have on their iPad, as well as providing the database services to store all of the questions and answers and the quiz questions and things like that. And we're able to do that by combining together Python programming on the robot with some PHP scripting on a server and stuff like that, and communicating over a network. So that's the now robot. Don't know what happened to the Choreograph title there on the right hand side. It moved in a bit of a strange spot. But there on the right hand side you can see what Choreograph actually looks like and how we use it. So that's a little bit about the project that we're doing, and it sort of adds to this stuff that we're doing in terms of mixed reality. It's all about introducing this stuff into the classroom, having that kind of STEAM infrastructure. But one of the biggest problems with the now robot is that he's really expensive. So I've heard somebody go, oh. He's around about, depending on whether you get the brand new on a good day or not, around about $13,000. Okay, so it's an expensive robot to buy, which is why we tried to justify it by saying you can use him in lots of classes, you can use him for lots of different things. I mean, if your $15,000 robot works a 40-hour week, well then hopefully that's okay. But it does pose the question which James raised earlier, right? Which is, how do we work all of this stuff out? Right? There's all of these things out there that you can use for mixed reality, for robotics, to build up this really innovative STEAM classroom or STEAM infrastructure across your school. How do we actually think about how those things work? And unfortunately, I don't have the immediate answer for you. There is a conference that you might want to go and have a look at. This futureclassrooms.org/STEAM talks a little bit about future STEAM classrooms and what they should actually look like. But it's a few years old now. The video, or that link, I think the last one they did was in 2014. So it doesn't include a lot of stuff about mixed reality and robotics and some of these new technologies that we've seen coming along. So the question becomes, well, how do we work all of that stuff into our school and into our classrooms? And the answer is that really when it comes down to it, the choice comes down to a choice between cheap solutions or more expensive stuff. And one of the best things about both mixed reality and robotics at the moment is that there is an option for you to do either, depending on what works best in your particular school and in your particular classroom. All of the stuff that we did with mobile mixed reality uses just a mobile phone and a colour cross or a Google Cardboard, which James will give you if you answer a question right at the end, I think. Alternatively, there are things like the Samsung Gear VR. There's the Daydream headset that you can get from Google. All of those various different types of things. And the idea of all of these is that they're cheap, right? If the students have access to a standard mobile device, then they can use one of these things to then incorporate mobile mixed reality into their learning. And so when we built the paramedics project in particular, we really focused on that. We knew we were going to send it to distance students, and so we made something that was cheap and easy for those students to use when they got it posted to them. We weren't able to send them all a HTC Vive or an Oculus Rift. Similarly, in robotics, if you want something cheap, Lego Mindstorms is a very popular kit. I suspect a lot of you probably have the Lego Mindstorms kit for robotics. And Sparrow is also very popular as a cheap robotic solution. And James has several Sparrows sitting in his office that I always want to play with when I go to his office. And I've seen people use both Lego Mindstorms and Sparrow for stuff outside of the STEAM classroom, which was the point I was trying to make about the robotics before. People using things like Sparrow to teach concepts like history and geography and social science, other aspects of social science. Once you start thinking about how these things might exist outside of trying to teach kids how to do programming or robotics, you can see a wide variety of different uses of that technology. And then, of course, if you've got lots of money, you can also use the more expensive options if you want to. Oculus Rift or HTC Vive is very much the popular virtual reality headset that you can get at the moment. The picture there on the right-hand side is the CEO or former CEO of Oculus, Palmer Lucy. I think he's current. I can't remember if he's still there. But anyway, he's the guy that basically invented the Oculus Rift. This was his debut on the Time magazine cover, which I feel, unfortunately, is a bit of an unfortunate photo. If you're going to appear on the front of Time magazine, anyway, what could you do? And then there are other things like Microsoft HoloLens. Microsoft HoloLens is Microsoft's approach for augmented reality. It's a totally self-contained headset that you can wear to do augmented reality in a room. You can also have 3D printers as well. And then, of course, I showed you the Now robot a little bit earlier. There's also a bigger version of the Now robot, which Boris mentioned, the Pepper robot, which wheels around on wheels and has arms. And they're talking about building another robot called Romeo, which is going to be about 4 foot tall. Imagine a robot that looks exactly like Now, but about twice as tall as the Now robot, right? And we're looking forward to that one because I think it'll be able to do some really interesting stuff. But I can't imagine how much it's going to cost. So it's up to you in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of what you do in your classroom. And I know most of you are ICT managers. I think it comes down to that balance between the cheap solutions and the more expensive options. And I have talked to a lot of schools that are willing to do the more expensive stuff, but I think also James and I quite often talk to schools, and when we show them things like the paramedics demo that James showed you, and we say this works on a standard mobile phone with the colour cross cardboard thing and some 3D printed tools that you can print out for a couple of bucks, then they start to go, oh wow, we don't need to spend $1,000 on HTC Vive. Instead, we can buy a headset mount for every student in our class and build up our infrastructure that way. But the right solution, I think, in the end is that combination of the two. This idea of building infrastructure for creativity, because let's be honest, as I said to you, I don't have a silver bullet. I can't tell you, and people ask us this all the time, right? What's the best VR solution? And James goes, I don't know. No. Today, HTC Vive. 6 months from now, who knows, right? So the better approach is to combine the two things together and build an infrastructure for creativity for the students, a combination of those cheap and those more expensive options. And I think if you want to take motivation for this, think of this idea of a makerspace. And the idea of a makerspace, I think in the most idealistic way, is that our students have the opportunity to work with lots and lots of different things in that environment for creativity. And a makerspace includes, a good makerspace includes, stuff to allow them to do soldering, little Arduinos, Raspberry Pis, pieces of fabric, sewing machines, lathes, 3D printers, all of these different things that build up an infrastructure for STEAM, which can include mixed reality and robotic stuff and 3D printing stuff. And indeed, I have seen that in schools. So, how does this all link back to what James said at the beginning? Well, the thing I'm going to finish on, which should leave us a few minutes for questions, hopefully, is this idea is that it isn't about teaching the tool, because the tools change too quickly, right? And I said to you, the idealistic idea of the digital technologies curriculum is it's about teaching the skills. And when we talk about mixed reality and robotics, it's the same thing. It's about building those environments to nurture creative thinking, problem solving, agility, digital skills, entrepreneurship and communication. And this comes out of that report that James was talking to you about earlier today, from the World Economic Forum. So the last thing I'm going to say then is something that I often say when I'm talking to people from schools, in particular teachers, which sounds really obvious when you say it, but I think is worth saying, which is that it should be about pedagogy before technology. And I mean, it sounds obvious. Of course, it should be about the pedagogy, not about the technology. But sometimes we can get so caught up thinking about the technology that we forget that we need to have a use for that technology before we introduce it into the school, right? A HoloLens is a good example, right? So a HoloLens is great. A HoloLens is a cool piece of technology. I've got one sitting on my desk right now, waiting to be unpacked, right? But the problem with HoloLens is that it costs in Australia like $4,000. And if you're going to buy a HoloLens just because you think it's a cool piece of technology, well then you're going to then have to try and find pedagogy that supports it. What might be better instead is to think about the pedagogy first. Say, what do our students need? What are we trying to teach them? And then what technology would best support that approach to teaching? And again, I say this often, and I often use the analogy, which James has heard me use before, that if the best approach to a particular type of pedagogy in your classroom is to stand up in a clown suit and teach the class as a clown instead, then do that, right? It doesn't have to involve the technology. But hopefully, especially people like us, we can help the teachers work out what technology would help them to enhance what happens in their classroom. So maybe the robot can wear the clown suit instead, right? And that'll be even better. Yeah. And James and I, last time we talked about this, came up with this model for that, which again seems sort of obvious when you put it on the slide, but I think it's worth saying, which is that you should always start with the problem. You should then think about how you can solve the problem. And then finally, step number 3 should be, how can the technology help? And then evaluate, see how things went, and go back and see whether you've solved the problem or not. And of course, that also means that sometimes you'll use the cheaper technology or the different technology because that's the most appropriate technology, which, as I said earlier, suits us sometimes. So I think that's about it. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I didn't do too bad, yeah? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite James back up, and if you've got any questions, we're happy to field those questions. As I said, we both know about mixed reality and robotics and all that kind of stuff, so throw us whatever you want, and we'll see what we can do.
Just talking to our online registrants as well. If you've got any questions, you don't have audio. You're in webinar mode, so if you just put your questions into Q&A, if you can, I'll pass them on to our presenters. That's for our external people. Questions, anybody? I'd ask all day, by the way, if we're going to have any questions for our external recordings, that we use a mic or swap them around. Any questions?
What devices can you use? Sorry. What devices can you use in these cardboard cutout visual things?
Any BYOD mobile phones, so iOS, Android, doesn't matter which version.
Are these for us to keep?
Yes. So you can work out who's going to keep it in the group.
James,
Originally it was going to be ask a question, get one, but I thought I'd show it as we go around just to get a bit of an idea. But essentially it's a Google Cardboard, but it's branded. So if you actually want to think about the use of those in the schools, so maybe in your intro pack, when the child comes into the school environment, they get the bag plus the headset. And you say, we give this at the start of the semester, and if you lose it or whatever happens to it, then they're $10 pop to get a new one. But essentially it's a Google Cardboard, but the idea with it is that it's accessible, so it's accessible technology, BYOD, so whether that's BYOD their own phones or devices within the school infrastructure, and essentially the concept being that you can do everything with that you might do with a Samsung Gear VR or those types of things. Yes, the fidelity of it is not going to be the same as something like HTC Vive, but the idea with this is accessibility.
When I was at Future Schools with Ian, there was a booth there that was actually giving these away. Right, so they, you basically walked up to the booth and they gave you one. And why they gave us one is they were hoping that we'd contact them later to try and get a set of like 30 or 60 or something like that. And they were selling them, as James said, very, very cheaply, a few bucks each. Right, so you could buy a whole set for a whole class for a couple $100.
Bond buys them in literally 1,000 lots. So that's the.
Got a question from Laura online. Primary schools do not tend to have mobile phones to use in these cardboard frames. So what is a cheaper alternative for them? Do they work with iPads?
So you can't use a Google Cardboard style device or a Samsung Gear VR device with an iPad, but you can definitely use an iPad for augmented reality. So the stuff that we did with networking was on an iPad, not an iPhone, because we thought they'd value the bigger screen. We didn't think they needed the stereoscopic style device. So yeah, in primary schools use iPads, or as James suggested, maybe have a set of devices that are available for students to loan out.
The other thing there as well, which becomes interesting, is hybriding that with something like a 360-degree camera, and then the kids can start exploring, navigating those 360 spaces. There was that discussion at the beginning about the virtual excursions. How do you leverage things like live stream, YouTube 360, and then the kids in the classes being able to view that, maybe in out and about in the grounds of the school as well, which a number of schools are sort of experimenting the idea of getting them out of the classroom, so outdoor learning pedagogy. So how can we look at what you did outside and bring that back in, and let's start exploring those things as well.
Okay, any other questions from the floor or from people online? I might just finish with a quick one of my own. The HoloLens stuff, from what I've read, seems possibly the most exciting platform development that may be coming down the track you guys are starting to develop. Would you agree with that?
Dr. Burt would have his own opinion about it. I'd be interested to hear it. But when people ask me about HoloLens, I say that I think HoloLens is probably the most interested augmented reality headset that's currently out there. So it's not VR, it's AR, right? So when you look through the HoloLens, you can still see the real world, but you can see the digital objects imposed upon the real world. One of the most interesting things about HoloLens is that it understands context, uses the Connect technology so that when you look at something, it knows there's a table there. It knows there's a chair there, so it's possible for you to put things on top of the table or on top of the chair. It knows what room you're in because it works out where your Wi-Fi network is and it does triangulation. So you can have different digital objects in this room than you can have in the room next door. So as far as AR devices go, yeah, I find HoloLens really exciting. As I said, I've got one sitting on my desk at work. I'm waiting to open it until I've got a few free minutes, and then I'll have a bit of a play with it. Of course, thinking about pedagogy first. What do you think about HoloLens? You've never told me.
Yeah, I think we're
really outside.
A couple of sentences. So look, I've got 3 of the things that sit in my lab and also in my classroom. So my main pedagogy is exploring really difficult problems that you might solve out in the world. So that might be with, say for instance, police doing room clearances, or it might be in exploring how you might talk to maybe attackers or potential confronting scenarios. So how can you start to get the kids to maybe react with virtual avatars but situated within the environments? So the realism of it is quite impressive. The technology and the integration of all the technology is very impressive, but it's a first generational device, and I think realistically we're probably about 3 to 5 years, maybe the next generation is what we're sort of looking for.
He's less sold on it than me, but he's got 3 and I've only got 1.
All right, could we thank, please, Michael and James?